2 in the morning. The Russian Ilyushin-76, modified for electronic warfare, was already ghosting along the northern edge of Polish airspace. The crew had been flying in absolute radio silence for 4 hours. Their mission not to observe or to engage, but to erase. Could the collective defense of a continent, built upon hundreds of billions of dollars of integrated technology, be undone by a single, focused surge of electromagnetic energy? The Baltic air outside the cockpit was thin and freezing, biting at the pressurized hull of the massive aircraft as it maintained its orbit. Below the fuselage, the dark expanse of the sea looked like a sheet of cold obsidian, hiding the silent, low-level movements of a strike package already accelerating into the blind spots. The Ilyushin-76, designated by the Russian command as the Secord, Beriev A-100, extended its internal transmission arrays, pulsing with a power draw that dimmed the lights in the cockpit to a faint, amber glow. Within seconds, the invisible waves of high-powered interference began to wash over the northern coast of Europe, striking the sophisticated SPY-6 radar arrays of the naval destroyers and the Patriot missile batteries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. On every monitoring screen, from Warsaw to Berlin, the crisp data points of a monitored sky suddenly dissolved into a flickering, chaotic blizzard of electronic snow. This was the moment the strategic planners in Moscow had gambled on for 3 decades, believing that the West's absolute reliance on digital supremacy was not its greatest strength, but its most fatal vulnerability. The war had not begun with a sudden declaration or a grand diplomatic gesture, but with a series of failed treaties and a growing, dark resentment that had curdled in the frozen corridors of the Kremlin over generations. For years, the steady eastward expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had been viewed through the lens of historical trauma, a perceived encroachment that the Russian leadership believed demanded a violent, decisive correction. On the other side of the border, the democratic nations of Europe had long since convinced themselves that the age of heavy metal warfare was a relic of the 20th century, choosing instead to invest in the invisible ether of the internet and the orbital precision of the satellite. Now, those satellites were being blinded by ground-based lasers and orbital jammers, and the internet was a screaming cacophony of white noise, leaving 2 million soldiers standing in the dark, waiting for a blow they could no longer see coming. The Russian strike package, consisting of 40 Su-57 stealth fighters and over 100 cruise missiles, utilized the sudden electronic vacuum to descend to dangerously low altitudes. They flew beneath the traditional radar horizons that were now being choked by the Ilyushin's jamming, following the jagged contours of the Vistula River and the dark forests of the Polish border. By neutralizing the Aegis Ashore systems and the integrated air defense networks of northern Germany, the Russian command had successfully created a corridor of vulnerability 300 kilometers wide. The strategic objective was simple and devastating: to decapitate the logistical command centers and fuel depots of the alliance before a single Allied fighter could even reach its scramble altitude. Inside the darkened, reinforced command bunkers of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the air grew thick with the sharp smell of ozone and the frantic heat of overheating server processors. Men, women stared at monitors that showed nothing but the digital equivalent of a void, their hands hovering over keyboards that no longer commanded the weapons of the sky. Outside these bunkers, the stillness of the Polish countryside was shattered not yet by explosions, but by the low-pitched, chest-thumping hum of twin-engine jets passing overhead at less than 500 meters. The sound was a physical weight, a vibration, that rattled the windows of farmhouse bedrooms and sent winter birds screaming into the night, signaling a change in the world that no one was prepared to accept. The first phase of the campaign was not measured in blood or broken armor, but in the total loss of certainty and the collapse of the information age. As the Russian strike package neared its primary targets, the realization began to sink in among the Allied commanders that the high-tech shield of the West had been turned into a digital shroud. It was a terrifying testament to the fragility of modern civilization, where a handful of electrons, fired with calculated precision, could push the most advanced military alliance in human history back into the era of the bayonet and the blind fire. The silence of the radar was the loudest warning they would receive, and for many, it would be the last. 2:15 in the morning. The situational command centers in Brussels and the deep bunkers beneath the Kremlin. The clocks on the walls of these two worlds ticked toward the same inevitable conclusion, yet they moved through two entirely different versions of history, each one written in the blood of previous centuries and the cold, unyielding logic of modern geography. For the planners in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the sudden electronic blackout was a violation of an international order that had stood, however precariously, since the end of the Cold War. It was an affront to the idea that borders were sacrosanct and that the digital age had rendered the bayonet and the heavy tank obsolete. But for the men in Moscow, this was not a violation, but a reclamation, a desperate and violent attempt to push back the encroaching walls of a world that had sought to minimize their influence and ignore their deep-seated fears of encirclement and strategic irrelevance. The war had been brewing in the quiet rooms of diplomacy for over a decade, starting with the slow, agonizing erosion of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and the eventual abandonment of the Open Skies Agreement, which had once allowed both sides to look into the other's backyard and confirm that no one was preparing for the end of the world. As these layers of trust were stripped away like skin from a wound, the two superpowers found themselves staring at each other across the narrow, claustrophobic corridor of the Suwalki Gap, a 60-mile stretch of land that separated the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad from its ally in Belarus. This small piece of Earth became the focal point of a global neurosis, a geographical bottleneck where the pride of two empires would eventually collide, with the force of 1,000 suns, even if those suns were currently cloaked in the artificial night of electronic warfare. In the years leading up to the 21st of March, 2026, the rhetoric had shifted from the language of economics to the language of survival, with both sides convincing their populations that the other was an existential threat that could only be neutralized through total mobilization. The democratic nations of the West had leaned heavily into their technological superiority, building a network of sensors and satellites that promised a transparent battlefield where no enemy could move without being seen and targeted within seconds. They had traded mass for precision, believing that a single, smart missile could replace 1,000 unguided shells. But in doing so, they had forgotten the ancient, brutal lesson that a blind giant is just as vulnerable as a child if his eyes are plucked out by a clever and desperate adversary. Meanwhile, the Russian military had embraced a philosophy of organized chaos, investing heavily in the very tools that were now being used to tear the digital fabric of the alliance apart, preferring the blunt instrument of the jammer and the heavy weight of the rocket over the surgical precision of the West. They understood that in a fight between two exhausted boxers, the one who can turn off the lights in the arena has the immediate advantage, regardless of who has the better technique or the more expensive equipment. This was a war of attrition disguised as a war of high technology, a struggle where the ultimate winner would not be the one with the most advanced computer, but the one with the most resilient spirit and the deepest stockpiles of unguided iron and raw, disposable manpower. The atmosphere in the capitals of the world was one of heavy, suffocating dread, as if the entire planet were holding its breath while waiting for the first nuclear flash that everyone feared but no one dared to mention aloud in the light of day. In Washington, the president sat in a silence that was more terrifying than any siren, surrounded by advisors who could offer no clear path forward, because their entire strategy had been predicated on an information advantage that had vanished in a single hour of electromagnetic interference. In Moscow, the silence was of a different quality. It was the silence of a hunter who has finally cornered a long elusive prey and is now deciding whether to strike with everything at once or simply wait for the cold and the dark to do the work for him. The history books would later describe this period as the Great Blindness, a time when the collective wisdom of the human race was discarded in favor of a primitive urge to dominate and destroy, fueled by a toxic mix of old grievances and new technologies. But for the soldiers sitting in their rain-soaked foxholes and the pilots flying through the electronic fog, there was no history, only the immediate, terrifying reality of a world where the gods of the machine had suddenly gone silent, leaving them to face the coming storm with nothing but their training and the cold steel in their hands. The geopolitical context was a tapestry of broken promises and misunderstood intentions, a map of a world that no longer existed, being rapidly replaced by a new, violent reality that was currently being written in the smoke rising from the first shattered radar arrays along the Baltic coast. 2:22 in the morning, Spangdahlem Air Base, Germany. The F-35 Alpha Lightning II fighters of the 480th Fighter Squadron were already screaming down the rain-slicked runway, their afterburners tearing two jagged holes of orange fire into the wet, freezing darkness of the Eifel Mountains. The air was thick with the heavy scent of unburnt JP-8 fuel and the ozone of 1,000 overtaxed electrical systems, a sensory overload that mirrored the frantic, disjointed scramble of pilots who were being launched into a sky that had suddenly become a digital graveyard. These men and women had spent their entire careers training for a war of surgical precision and total information dominance. Yet, as they retracted their landing gear and climbed into the overcast clouds, they were entering a void where their most powerful tools had been turned against them. Inside the cockpit of the lead aircraft, the pilot stared at a primary multifunction display that should have been a crystalline map of the tactical world, but was instead a chaotic swarm of flickering ghosts and false telemetry. The sophisticated sensor fusion that normally allowed an F-35 pilot to see through the floor of their own jet was now a liability, a blinding flood of electromagnetic white noise that threatened to overwhelm the aircraft's mission. Computers. He was flying comm out and radar silent, a primitive mode of operation that the United States Air Force had not been forced to use in a major conflict since the days of the Vietnam War, and the psychological weight of that isolation felt heavier than the 6G forces pressing him into his seat. The flight toward the Polish border was a journey into an absolute, suffocating blackness, where the traditional markers of navigation, the global positioning system, and the tactical air navigation beacons had been completely erased by the Russian electronic offensive. The pilots were forced to rely on inertial navigation and the raw, unrefined visuals of their infrared cameras, peering through the darkness for the silhouettes of their wingmen against the pale, cold moonlight that managed to filter through the heavy cloud deck. Every few minutes, a sudden surge of high-powered microwave interference would cause the cockpit lights to flicker and the flight controls to shudder, a physical reminder that the enemy was not just in the sky ahead of them, but was already inside the very circuits of their machines. There was a profound, terrifying irony in First S. The fact that the most expensive and advanced weapon system in human history was now being flown like a mid-century interceptor, with the pilot's eyes darting between the dark horizon and the backup analog instruments. The sense of godlike invulnerability that had characterized Western air power for 30 power intensity years had vanished in a single hour, replaced by the ancient, animal fear of the unknown and the realization that they were no longer the hunters, but potentially the prey. They moved through the Baltic air like ghosts in a haunted house, waiting for a flash of fire or the sudden, frantic chirp of a radar warning receiver that might only give them 3 seconds to live before a Russian missile ended their journey. The geopolitical weight of their mission pressed down on the squadron like the cold Baltic fog, for they were the first line of defense against a strike package that was currently screaming westward at twice the speed of sound. If they failed to intercept the incoming Russian bombers and cruise missiles, the logistical heart of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Europe would be torn out before the sun rose, leaving the continent open to a ground invasion the likes of which had not been seen in 80 years. Yet, how could they intercept what they could not see? And how could they fight a war where the enemy had successfully weaponized the very vacuum of information? This was the new face of war among superpowers, a collision of high-tech dreams and low-tech nightmares, where the ultimate deciding factor was no longer the speed of a processor, but the steady hand of a pilot who was willing to fly into the mouth of a digital storm. As the squadron crossed into Polish airspace at 30,000 feet, the lead pilot looked out at the vast, dark expanse of the eastern horizon and saw the first faint streaks of white light, not the dawn, but the exhaust trails of 100 missiles rising to meet them. The silence of the radio was finally broken by the one sound no pilot ever wants to hear in the dark: the continuous, high-pitched scream of a locked-on enemy fire control radar that had somehow found a way to pierce the veil. 2:25 in the morning. The Kaliningrad Oblast and the surrounding Baltic Sea. The first wave of the Russian strike package was no longer a theoretical threat on a map, but a physical wall of screaming metal and burning kerosene accelerating toward the heart of Europe. While the Allied pilots struggled to make sense of their flickering cockpits, the Russian Sukhoi 57 Felon fighters moved through the electronic corridor with the predatory confidence of wolves that had spent years studying the fence lines of a sleeping flock. The air around the Russian launch sites was thick with the suffocating smell of burnt propellant and the sharp, metallic tang of ionized air, as dozens of mobile missile launchers finished their cycles and prepared to reposition before the inevitable, desperate retaliation. The primary hammer of the Russian offensive consisted of over 120 Kh-101 cruise missiles, each one a low observable blade of steel, skimming just 30 meters above the whitecaps of the Baltic Sea. These missiles did not rely on the blinded satellite networks, but instead used internal terrain contour matching and inertial guidance systems that were immune to the very jamming the Russian Ilyushin was currently pouring into the atmosphere. To an observer on the ground, they would appear only as blurred shadows moving at 800 kilometers per hour, their small turbofan engines emitting a low, haunting whistle that was swallowed by the crashing of the waves long before the sound could reach a human ear. They were the silent messengers of a doctrine that prioritized the total destruction of an enemy's ability to sustain a war, targeting fuel manifolds in Gdansk and the critical ammunition piers at Bremerhaven. Behind the cruise missiles, the Sukhoi 57 fighters maintained a high-altitude screen, their internal weapon bays holding the R-77-1 air-to-air missiles that were programmed to engage any Allied aircraft brave enough to enter the blind zone. The Russian pilots, much like their Western counterparts, were flying in a world of restricted data, but they were operating within a plan that had been practiced in the cold, vast expanses of the Siberian training ranges for a generation. They understood that this was the window of opportunity, a fleeting, 30-minute gap where the electronic fog was at its thickest and the NATO response was at its most disjointed, and they pushed their engines to the thermal limit to ensure they reached their release points before the Allied defense could find its footing. There was a grim, mechanical beauty to the coordination of the strike, a manifestation of a national will that had been focused for years on the single task of breaking the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in a single catastrophic evening. The Russian command knew that they could not win a prolonged war of attrition against the combined industrial might of the West, and so they had bet everything on this initial paralyzing blow to the nervous system of the alliance. Every missile launch was a gamble with the future of the continent, a calculated risk taken by men who believed that the only way to ensure their own security was to leave their neighbors in ruins and their rivals in a state of terminal shock. As the strike package crossed the invisible line that marked the beginning of the Polish coastline, the first of the Iskander-M tactical missile systems began their terminal dives from the edge of space, appearing on the few functioning Allied thermal sensors as streaks of white-hot fire falling at 6 times the speed of sound. These ballistic missiles were aimed at the hardened command bunkers and the underground fiber optic hubs that linked the various national capitals of Europe, intended to sever the head of the alliance from its body. The ground beneath the launch sites in Kaliningrad shuddered with the departure of each rocket, a rhythmic, bone-deep vibration that seemed to echo the heartbeat of a nation that had finally decided to cast aside the pretense of peace in favor of the absolute certainty of the sword. The sky over the Baltic was now a tapestry of intersecting exhaust trails and the faint, glowing embers of decoy flares a visual representation of a geopolitical order that was being torn apart in real time. The Russian pilots looked down at the dark, unsuspecting cities of Poland and Germany and saw not centers of culture or history, but a series of tactical coordinates that needed to be neutralized to ensure the survival of their own motherland. It was a cold, mathematical approach to mass destruction, a philosophy of war that viewed the human cost as a secondary concern to the achievement of the strategic objective. And as the first cruise missiles reached their inland targets, the era of the strike package gave way to the era of the impact. 2:31 in the morning. The Baltic coast of Poland, near the historical port city of Gdynia. The air was sharp with the scent of wet pine and the biting salt spray of the sea, a natural stillness that was about to be torn apart by the chemical roar of solid-state rocket fuel, and the desperate screams of men who had realized that their digital shield had finally failed them. The 67th Air Defense Artillery Regiment of the United States Army, alongside their Polish counterparts, were no longer looking at the clean, high-fidelity digital symbology of their AN/MPQ-65 radar sets, which were currently saturated by a blinding deluge of Russian electronic interference that made every screen look like a window into a snowstorm. Instead, they were forced to revert to the primitive, utilizing legacy optical tracking systems and short-range infrared sensors, electronic eyes that could only see a few miles into the freezing gloom, waiting for the first heat signatures of the Russian Kh-101 cruise missiles to break the horizon. This was the kinetic collision that the world had dreaded for 80 years. The first direct exchange of fire between the forces of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Russian Federation on the soil of a sovereign European nation. The tactical reality was a chaotic, fragmented nightmare where the highly centralized command structure of the West was being forced to decentralize into individual batteries, each one fighting its own private war in the dark. Without the overarching guidance of the satellite network or the high-altitude surveillance aircraft, the decision to fire fell to young sergeants and lieutenants who had only seconds to distinguish between a Russian missile and a friendly fighter jet struggling to return to base. It was a regression to a more visceral, more terrifying form of combat, where the survival of a city depended not on a computer algorithm, but on the raw reflexes and the steady hands of human beings pushed to the absolute limit of their endurance. The first launch came from a Patriot battery positioned on a low ridge overlooking the bay, the MIM-104. Missile shrieking off its canisters with a violent, white-hot flash that bleached the surrounding forest of all color for a single, staggering second. The sound was not a bang, but a continuous, chest-compressing roar that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of the soldier's bones. As the PAC-3 interceptor accelerated to 4 times the speed of sound, in pursuit of a shadow it could barely track. This was followed by a second, then a third launch, the exhaust trails carving jagged, glowing scars across the black sky, a visual testament to the defiance of an alliance that refused to be blinded without a fight. The heat from the launches was so intense that it melted the frost on the nearby pine needles, turning the air into a thick, steaming fog that smelled of burnt rubber and high explosives. 6 miles offshore, the first Russian Kh-101 cruise missile met its end, not in a clean intercept, but in a chaotic mid-air collision that sent thousands of pieces of burning titanium raining down into the cold Baltic waters. The resulting fireball was a brilliant, momentary sun that illuminated the silhouettes of the Russian strike package for the first time, revealing a swarm of missiles and fighters that looked like a plague of locusts descending on a harvest. But for every missile intercepted, 3 more slipped through the gaps in the blinded defense, their low-profile shapes hugging the contours of the Polish hills. As they raced toward their designated targets, the defenders could feel the pressure of the incoming wave, a physical weight of impending destruction that made every breath feel like a struggle against a rising tide of fire. The consequences of this first exchange were immediate and devastating, as the first of the Russian Iskander missiles found its mark on a communications hub just outside of Warsaw, the detonation sending a shockwave that was felt 50 kilometers away. The digital silence that had begun with the electronic warfare offensive was now being reinforced by the physical destruction of the infrastructure that had once linked the modern world together. As the smoke rose from the first craters, the philosophical weight of the conflict began to settle over the battlefield. The realization that the era of the clean war was over, and that the world had entered a new, dark age of attrition, where the only measure of success was the ability to endure the unendurable. The soldiers on the ground watched as the sky above Gdynia turned a deep, sickly orange, the reflection of burning fuel depots, and shattered hangars dancing on the underside of the heavy cloud deck. There was no triumph in the first kills, only a grim, hollow understanding that the threshold had been crossed, and that there was no way back to the world as it had been at midnight. The Great Blindness had been followed by the Great Fire, and as the first Russian Sukhoi 57 fighters began to lock onto the Patriot batteries that had revealed their positions by firing, the exchange moved from a defensive struggle into a mutual slaughter. The silence of the night was gone, replaced by the relentless, rhythmic pounding of a war that had finally found its voice. A voice that spoke only of ash and the end of all things. 2:37 in the morning. The dark, pressurized cockpit of a lead F-35 Bravo. The pilot, callsign Reaper 1, saw the world not through his high-resolution helmet display, but through the raw, grainy green of his backup infrared sensors. As the electronic fog of the Russian Ilyushin jammed his primary radar into a state of uselessness, he was now within 20 miles of the Russian strike package, entering the merge, where the sophisticated long-range game of digital chess devolved into a prehistoric knife fight. In a darkened room, the air around the jet was a freezing, turbulent soup of salt spray and the ionized discharge of 1,000 jamming pods, creating a shimmering halo of static that seemed to cling to the edges of his canopy. The engagement began with the sudden, violent clarity of a lightning strike. The trigger was squeezed. The AIM-120 Advanced Medium Range air-to-air missile shrieked off the internal rail of the F-35, a white column of fire punching backward through the cold air, and momentarily lighting the underside of the fuselage with a blinding, chemical glare. The solid rocket motor roared with a high-pitched, predatory scream that could be felt in the pilot's teeth even through his carbon fiber helmet. The missile accelerated to 3,000 kilometers per hour in less than 5 seconds, its independent radar seeker desperately trying to burn through the Russian interference to find the heat of a Sukhoi 35 engine. The warhead punched through the titanium wing spar of the lead Russian fighter, detonating its 11-kilogram blast fragmentation charge with a force that sent thousands of tungsten cubes tearing through the fuel cells and the cockpit. The Sukhoi 35 erupted instantly into a jagged blossom of orange and black, the aircraft breaking into 3 distinct pieces that continued to tumble forward at supersonic speeds. A fireball that bleached the sky white for 3 full miles expanded outward, vaporizing the hydraulic fluid and sending a rain of molten aluminum into the black waves below. There was no time for the pilot to eject. There was only the momentary flash of a cockpit disintegrating into a cloud of glowing fragments. The Russian wingman, flying a Sukhoi 57 stealth fighter, wrenched his control stick hard to the left, his G-suit inflating with a sharp hiss, as he pulled 9 times the force of gravity to avoid the expanding debris field of his leader. His eyes were wide, fixed on the burning wreckage that was already falling toward the sea like a dying star, but his hands moved with the practiced, lethal precision of a man who had been born for this collision. He punched out a volley of magnesium flares that illuminated the dark Baltic air with a frantic, flickering rhythm, then rolled his aircraft inverted and dove toward the deck, his own sensors finally locking onto the heat signature of the American jet that had just revealed its position by firing. Black smoke and the smell of burning jet fuel hung in the freezing air, even at 30,000 feet, a toxic residue that marked the spot where $200 million of engineering had just been erased from existence. The debris was still glowing as it hit the surface of the water, sending up geysers of steam that were immediately swallowed by the darkness. The radio channels, which had been a wall of white noise only seconds before, suddenly erupted in a cacophony of panicked breathing and Russian commands, each voice strained by the physical pressure of the high-speed maneuvers. The silent thunder of the electronic war had finally been replaced by the very real, very loud sound of metal tearing metal. The battle for the Kaliningrad airspace was no longer a matter of strategic planning or geopolitical posturing. It was a visceral, chaotic struggle for survival, where the loss of a single pilot felt like the loss of an entire world. For every American missile that found its mark, a Russian counterstrike was already in the air. A deadly exchange of fire that promised no survivors and no clear victory. The sky was filled with the falling iron of a lost generation, and as the remaining aircraft from both sides dove into the clouds to continue the hunt, the realization began to sink in that the threshold of total war had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. The air was a graveyard of falling glass and burning titanium, and the night was only just beginning to show its true blood-red colors. 3 in the morning. The deep-water port of Bremerhaven was already a jagged landscape of orange flame and twisted steel, when the second wave of Russian cruise missiles arrived to finish what the first had started. The air was thick with the suffocating, oily stench of burning marine diesel, and the sharp, chemical bite of vaporized shipping containers that had once held the high-tech heartbeat of a continent. Above the harbor, the sky was a bruised and sickly purple, reflecting the fires that were now consuming the cranes, the piers, and the very lifeblood of the Allied reinforcement effort. This was the physical aftermath of the strike package, a calculated amputation of the West's ability to wage a sustained conventional war, executed with the cold, mathematical precision of a machine that knew no mercy. The destruction of these logistical hubs was a strategic catastrophe that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had spent 40 years convincing itself could never happen in the age of precision defense. For decades, the alliance had relied on the just-in-time delivery of American armor and ammunition across the Atlantic, believing that the sea was a safe and predictable highway for the projection of superpower strength. Now, that highway had been severed at its destination, leaving thousands of tons of critical supplies sinking into the oily harbor mud or evaporating in the intense heat of secondary explosions that shook the earth for miles. It was a physical manifestation of a geopolitical nightmare, where the vast industrial capacity of the United States was rendered irrelevant, because there was no longer a safe place to offload its weight. In the port of Gdansk, the fuel terminal erupted in a series of rhythmic, ground-shaking detonations that could be felt in the chests of civilians huddling in their basements 20 miles away. Each explosion sent a column of black, soot-heavy smoke 3,000 feet into the night air, illuminated from within by the roiling, white-hot heart of the fire that burned at over 1,000 degrees. The sound was a continuous, low-frequency roar, like 1,000 jet engines running at full power, drowning out the frantic sirens of the emergency services that were already overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. The heat was so intense that the asphalt on the nearby piers began to soften and run, like black wax, sealing the fate of any heavy equipment left behind in the initial, panicked scramble to evacuate the impact zones. The Russian strike package had successfully achieved its primary objective: the total paralysis of the Allied rear area before the ground war had even begun, to reach its true, bloody crescendo. Without the fuel from Gdansk or the spare parts and munitions from Bremerhaven, the heavy armored divisions currently rushing toward the Suwalki Gap were operating on a finite and rapidly shrinking clock. Every kilometer those tanks advanced took them further away from a supply chain that no longer existed, their fuel gauges ticking toward zero, as they moved into a battle that they could no longer sustain. It was a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare, where a relatively small investment in cruise missiles and electronic jamming had neutralized a multi-trillion-dollar military infrastructure in less than 60 minutes. There is a unique, hollow kind of silence that follows a great catastrophe. A stillness that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a profound and irreversible change in the order of things. As the fires continued to rage along the burning coast, the men and women of the Alliance looked at the ruins of their world and realized that the old rules of engagement were gone forever. The war was no longer something that happened in distant lands or on glowing computer screens. It was here, in the smell of their own burning cities and the sight of their shattered harbors. It was a heavy, philosophical realization that the cost of security is often paid in the very things we seek to protect, and that once the first match is struck, no one can truly control the direction of the wind or the spread of the flame. As the sun began its slow, indifferent climb toward the horizon, the smoke from the burning coast stretched out over the Baltic Sea, like a funeral shroud for the 20th century. The high-tech dream of a clean, electronic war had been replaced by the ancient, soot-stained reality of a conflict that would be measured in the number of shells fired and the number of lives discarded. The burning coast was not just a tactical success for the Russian command. It was a psychological blow that tore through the confidence of a generation, leaving them to face the long, cold night of a war that had only just begun to show its true face. The silence of the radar had led to the fire of the ports, and now there was only the wait for the iron to meet the iron on the plains of the east. 4 in the morning, the logistics hubs of eastern Poland and the shattered airfields of Germany. The crews of the 8th Maintenance Battalion were already knee-deep in the black, oily slush of a ruined motor pool, their hands numb from the freezing rain, and the relentless, vibrating hum of diesel generators struggling to keep the diagnostic computers alive. The air was a suffocating mixture of cold Atlantic fog and the acrid, metallic stink of burnt circuit boards, a sensory reminder that the high-tech nervous system of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had been physically seared by the opening Russian salvo. While the frontline units screamed for reinforcements that were currently sinking in the Baltic, these mechanics and engineers were fighting a different kind of war, a desperate manual struggle to reconnect the severed tendons of a superpower military. The logistical nightmare was not merely a matter of broken equipment, but a fundamental collapse of the just-in-time philosophy that had governed Western military planning for 3 decades. For years, the Alliance had operated under the assumption that the flow of spare parts and precision munitions was a guaranteed constant, a digital stream that could be managed from thousands of miles away with the click of a mouse. Now, with the primary fiber optic cables severed and the satellite uplinks jammed into uselessness, that stream had frozen solid, leaving thousands of multi-million-dollar platforms sitting idle for the lack of a single proprietary microchip or a specialized hydraulic seal. It was a brutal lesson in the fragility of complexity, where the most advanced fighting force in history found itself paralyzed by the very sophistication that was supposed to ensure its absolute dominance. At the forward arming and refueling points, the exhaustion was a physical weight that seemed to press the soldiers into the mud, their eyes sunken and hollow from 48 hours of continuous, high-intensity operations under the threat of constant missile fire. They worked in the dark, utilizing low-intensity red flashlights to guide the heavy cranes, as they reloaded the Mark 41 vertical launch systems with a dwindling supply of evolved Sea Sparrow missiles and Tomahawks. Each missile was a white, slender ghost in the darkness, weighing over 1,500 kilograms and requiring a level of precision that was nearly impossible to maintain while the Earth shook from distant Iskander detonations. The logistical chain was no longer a high-speed highway. It was a narrow, treacherous path through a burning forest, where every kilometer gained was paid for with the sweat of men who were reaching the absolute limits of human endurance. The Russian side was facing its own logistical crisis, though one born of a different set of failures and a more primitive yet resilient approach to the art of the long war. Their supply lines stretched back through the frozen marshes of Belarus and into the industrial heartlands of the Ural Mountains. Relying on a massive network of heavy rail and unguided, dumb munitions that were immune to electronic interference but vulnerable to the sheer friction of distance. The Russian command viewed their soldiers not as specialists to be preserved, but as the raw fuel for a machine that was designed to grind forward through the sheer weight of its own momentum, regardless of the cost in blood or iron. It was a collision between a delicate precision instrument and a massive, rusting sledgehammer. And as the night wore on, it was becoming increasingly unclear which one would shatter first under the relentless pressure of the exchange. This was the logistics of the long night, a phase of the conflict where the ultimate victor would not be the side with the most advanced fighter jet, but the side that could most effectively manage its own exhaustion and despair. The philosophical weight of the war began to settle over the repair bays and the ammunition depots like a cold, damp shroud, as the realization took hold that there would be no quick victory and no clean resolution to the madness. They were caught in a cycle of destruction and repair that seemed to have no exit, a mechanical purgatory where the only goal was to keep the machines running for one more hour, one more sortie, or one more defensive volley. The silence of the command networks had forced a return to the tactile, the physical, and the visceral, where the smell of grease and the sound of a wrench hitting a steel hull were the only certainties left in a world gone mad. As the first gray light of a winter dawn began to bleed through the smoke of the burning ports, the logistical struggle transitioned from a frantic scramble into a grim, rhythmic endurance test. The soldiers looked at the mountains of twisted metal and the crates of unexploded ordnance and saw not just the wreckage of a battle, but the wreckage of an entire way of life. The war had become a living thing, an insatiable beast that demanded a constant sacrifice of resources and lives just to maintain its own terrible existence. In the mud of Poland and the ruins of Germany, the question was no longer who was right, but who could hold on to their sanity long enough to see the end of a night that felt as though it might last forever. 5 in the morning. The Suwalki Gap. That narrow, precarious throat of land connecting the Baltic states to the rest of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The T-90M tanks of the 1st Guards Tank Army were already tearing through the thin frozen crust of the Polish border, their heavy tracks churning the dark earth into a thick, oily slurry that smelled of ancient peat and fresh diesel. This was the long-awaited Iron Tsunami, a massive concentration of armored might that had been gathered under the cover of the Great Blindness, now surging forward at 40 kilometers per hour, to seal the fate of the Baltics. The morning air was a suffocating mist of freezing rain and the sulfurous exhaust of 1,000 engines, a gray and lightless world where the only color was the dull, forest green of the Russian armor and the occasional, flickering orange of a crewman's cigarette. The ground offensive was the brutal, physical counterpart to the invisible war that had been raging in the electromagnetic spectrum for the last 3 hours. While the pilots and the technicians fought with electrons and high-frequency waves, the tank crews and the motorized infantry fought with the weight of steel and the raw power of 125mm smoothbore guns. There was a grim, historical symmetry to the movement, as the Russian columns followed the same paths that their grandfathers had taken 80 years prior, driven by a similar mix of strategic necessity and nationalistic fervor. To the men inside the tanks, the geopolitical nuances of the Suwalki Gap were irrelevant. They only knew the claustrophobic heat of the turret, the rhythmic clatter of the autoloader, and the terrifying certainty that they were the spearhead of a movement that could not be stopped without breaking the world. Defending the Polish side of the border was the 1st Armored Brigade of the 1st Cavalry Division of the United States Army, supported by a battalion of Polish Leopard 2A7 tanks. These units had been alerted by the sound of the Russian advance long before their blinded sensors could confirm the threat, the low-frequency rumble of the approaching armor vibrating through the hull of every Abrams and the chest of every infantryman. The American crews sat in their M1A2 SEP V3 tanks with their thermal sights clouded by the thick artificial smoke and the persistent electronic interference that turned their digital maps into a useless patchwork of gray squares. They were forced to fight a defensive battle at point-blank range, waiting for the massive, angular silhouettes of the T-90Ms to emerge from the freezing mist at a distance of less than 800 meters. The first engagement was not a coordinated tactical maneuver, but a series of violent, isolated collisions that occurred across a front 50 kilometers wide. A Russian tank would appear through the smoke, its gun tube already depressed, seeking a target, only to be met by the white-hot streak of an M829 armor-piercing round that would punch through its reactive armor and send the turret spinning into the mud. Seconds later, A Javelin anti-tank missile would drop from the gray sky, its tandem warhead erupting against the thin top armor of a Russian BMP-3, turning the vehicle into a pyre of burning magnesium and secondary explosions. The air was filled with the rhythmic, bone-shaking thud of heavy tank guns and the sharp, whip-crack sound of high-velocity rounds tearing through the atmosphere at 1,500 meters per second. This was the realization of the war literature style at its most visceral. The understanding that despite all the high-tech dreams of the 21st century, the ultimate arbiter of national destiny remained the heavy tank and the soldier who refused to yield his ground. The Suwalki Gap was becoming a graveyard of shattered iron, where the sophisticated active protection systems of both sides were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming fire. For every Russian column that was blunted by American fire, another would emerge from the woods to the north, driven by a command structure that viewed the loss of 100 tanks as an acceptable price for 20 kilometers of territory. The landscape was being physically transformed by the violence. The peaceful forests of Poland being shredded into a wasteland of splintered timber and cratered fields that looked like the surface of a dead planet. The philosophical weight of the ground war was a heavy, suffocating blanket that dampened the spirits of even the most seasoned commanders. They were watching the systematic destruction of the very best equipment and personnel their nations had to offer, a mutual consumption of resources that promised no winner, only a shared state of exhaustion and ruin. In the command centers, the maps were no longer updated with elegant digital icons, but with frantic, hand-drawn marks in red and blue grease pencil, a regression to the maps of 1945 that signaled the end of the illusion of control. The Great Blindness had stripped away the pretense of the clean war, and the ground offensive was stripping away the pretense of civilization itself, leaving only the raw, primitive struggle for survival in the mud and the dark. As the sun struggled to pierce the thick layer of battle smoke and electronic fog, the first wave of the Russian offensive began to slow, not because they had reached their objective, but because the sheer density of the wreckage had made the roads impassable. The resigned T-90 MiZ were forced to push the burning hulls of their own predecessors out of the way to continue the advance, a grisly and mechanical task that underscored the utter ruthlessness of the campaign. To the south, the American and Polish defenders were digging in for the second wave, their ammunition counts low and their nerves frayed by the constant thumping sound of artillery that never seemed to stop. The battle for the gap was transitioning from a blitzkrieg into a war of attrition, a long, bloody grind that would define the borders of the new world in the smoke and the ash of the old one. 6 in the morning. A shallow, mud-filled trench line 5 miles south of the Suwalki Gap. The soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, were no longer the precision-guided warriors of the 21st century, but had instead become the damp, shivering ghosts of 1916, huddled in the freezing mud of a Polish tree line while the world above them was systematically disassembled by iron and fire. The air was a thick, suffocating blanket of wet wool, iron-scented earth, and the persistent, metallic tang of cordite that seemed to coat the back of every throat. For 72 hours, the digital god-eye view of the battlefield had been dark, and the men had been forced to rediscover the ancient, animal instincts of the infantrymen, listening for the whistle of incoming steel and watching for the silhouette of a predator in the gray, rolling mist. The psychology of the trench was a slow, eroding force that stripped away the veneer of modern military professionalism, leaving only a raw, primitive focus on the next breath and the next magazine. These men had been trained to operate within a network of shared data and orbital oversight, yet they now found themselves in a world where the horizon was only 300 meters away and their only link to the rest of the army was a fraying copper wire, or a shouted command over the roar of the wind. There was a profound, hollow sense of abandonment that came with the digital silence, a feeling that the high-tech civilization they represented had already collapsed behind them, leaving them to defend the ruins with nothing but their courage and their rifles. The silence was shattered by the rhythmic, chest-thumping bass of a Russian heavy mortar battery the rounds impacting with a series of dull, earth-shaking thuds that sent geysers of black mud and splintered pine into the air. The ground shuddered. The trigger of a Russian T-90M tank was squeezed 300 meters to the north. A 125mm high-explosive fragmentation shell shrieked through the mist, a blurred shadow of gray steel that seemed to suck the air out of the trench. As it passed, the heat of the propellant wash scorched the top of the parapet, turning the frozen mud into a steaming slurry for a fraction of a second before the world turned white. The shell punched straight into the reinforced timber of a command bunker at the edge of the tree line, the detonation occurring deep within the earth. The roof of the bunker lifted 6 inches into the air before the entire structure collapsed inward, crushing 3 men and sending a lethal spray of jagged wood splinters and red-hot metal fragments through the adjacent fighting positions. A fireball that smelled of burnt electronics and old timber erupted from the crater, the shockwave compressing the chests of every soldier within 50 meters, and popping eardrums with a sound like a physical blow to the head. The screams that followed were not of anger, but of a deep primal shock that was immediately swallowed by the return of the mortar fire. Private First Class Miller, his face a mask of gray, dust and dried blood, wrenched himself upward from the bottom of the trench, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the launch tube of an AT-4 anti-tank weapon. He did not think of the geopolitical stakes or the nuclear threshold. He thought only of the massive, angular shape of the BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle that was currently grinding over the bodies of his squad mates toward his position. He shouldered the tube, the cold fiberglass biting into his neck, and fired. The backblast kicked up a huge cloud of steam and dirt, and the rocket streaked across the open field, a white-hot needle of light that found the seam between the Russian vehicle's turret and its hull. The BMP-3 erupted instantly as its internal ammunition racks cooked off, the turret being thrown 10 meters into the air like a discarded toy while the burning crew attempted to crawl from the hatches. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of black smoke and the smell of roasting meat and diesel, a vision of hell that was being repeated in every woodlot and every village across the Polish border. The Russian infantry, seeing their armor burn, dove for cover and began a frantic, overlapping exchange of fire with the American defenders. The air filled with the snapping sound of AK-12 rounds and the heavy, rhythmic chugging of M240 machine guns. This was the stalemate of the spirit, a moment where both sides were too exhausted to advance and too terrified to retreat, caught in a mutual slaughter that had no strategic logic left to sustain it. The soldiers looked at each other with the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen the end of the world and realized it was made of mud and broken iron. The philosophical weight of the war had shifted from the grand movements of divisions to the survival of the individual, yet even that felt like a hollow goal in a world where the sun could no longer find its way through the smoke. They were the last practitioners of a dying art, fighting a war that had been promised to be clean and fast, but had instead become a long, dark night of the soul. As the next wave of Russian artillery began to whistle overhead, the men in the trench simply lowered their heads and waited, their hearts beating in time with the hammers of a war that refused to end. 7 in the morning. The Situation Room in the White House and the National Defense Management Center in Moscow. The red lights of the nuclear command and control consoles were no longer a theoretical exercise. They were pulsing with a steady, rhythmic urgency that signaled the end of the conventional world. After 5 days of mutual slaughter in the mud of the Suwalki Gap and the burning ruins of the Baltic ports, both superpowers had reached the point where the only way to avoid a total collapse was to consider the unthinkable. The air in these underground bunkers was stale, recycled through heavy carbon filters that could not quite remove the metallic smell of anxiety and the bitter taste of cold, black coffee that had been sitting in porcelain cups for hours. Outside, the sun was rising over a continent that was currently choking on its own smoke, indifferent to the fact that the men in these rooms were debating whether or not to extinguish it forever. The conventional front line had stabilized into a jagged, bleeding scar that stretched from the Baltic coast to the borders of Belarus a landscape of craters and twisted iron where neither side could find the strength to deliver a final, decisive blow. The Russian Federation had seized the ground, but their armored divisions were exhausted. Their supply lines were being shredded by stay-behind teams, and the great blindness of their electronic warfare was beginning to flicker as Allied technicians found new ways to pierce the veil. Conversely, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was holding the line, but they were running out of precision munitions, and their reinforcement schedule had been pushed back weeks by the destruction of the German ports. This was the stalemate of the grave, a state of mutual attrition, where the only variable left to change the outcome was the introduction of sub-strategic nuclear weapons to escalate to de-escalate. In Moscow, the military leadership faced a terrifying use-it-or-lose-it dilemma, fearing that if they did not utilize their tactical nuclear advantage now, the inevitable arrival of the full weight of the United States military would eventually grind them into the dust. They looked at the maps of the Suwalki Gap and saw not a victory, but a graveyard of their finest Guards tank units, and the pressure to authorize a single 10-kiloton demonstration strike over the Baltic Sea was becoming an irresistible gravity. The decision was not being made with shouting or grand speeches, but in a heavy, oppressive silence in a room where no one would say the word nuclear aloud, as if the mere vibration of the air would be enough to trigger the sequence. They were the prisoners of their own doctrine, trapped by a logic that dictated that the only way to save the state was to risk the destruction of the species. In Washington, the president sat surrounded by advisors who were divided between those who advocated for immediate, proportional retaliation and those who pleaded for one last attempt at a diplomatic off-ramp that no longer seemed to exist. The digital links to the Russian command were a wall of encrypted static, a final consequence of the electronic war that had severed the very channels designed to prevent the end of the world. The American leadership understood that the first tactical nuclear detonation by the Russian Federation would leave them with only two choices: to surrender the Baltics and accept a new, violent reality in Europe, or to launch a counterstrike that would almost certainly spiral into a global thermonuclear exchange. It was a choice between a local defeat and a global extinction, a calculation that no human brain was ever designed to handle under the pressure of 5 days of sleeplessness and the weight of 10,000 years of civilization. The psychological atmosphere in both capitals was one of a deep, hollow despair, a realization that the high-tech machinery of the 21st century had led them back to the most primitive and terrifying of all human standoffs. They were two boxers who had beaten each other into a state of blind, bloody delirium, each one leaning on the other just to stay upright, with one hand secretly reaching for a knife that would end the fight but kill them both. The philosophical weight of the war had become a physical presence, a cold current that moved through the bunkers and the command centers, reminding everyone that once the nuclear threshold was crossed, the history of the world would be written in ash, if it were written at all. The commanders in the field, from the pilots of the F-35 Alpha fighters to the crews of the Iskander-M tactical missile systems, were now merely the spectators of their own fate, waiting for a signal that would change the nature of reality. They looked up at the gray morning sky and saw not the hope of a new day, but a canvas that might, at any moment, be bleached white by a light brighter than 1,000 suns. The war had reached its final, most dangerous phase, a pause between the last conventional shell and the first atomic flash where the future of the human race was being decided by a handful of men in rooms filled with the hum of computers and the silence of the dead. The threshold was a thin, invisible line in the dirt of Poland, and the world was currently balanced on its edge, waiting for the wind of history to give the final, fatal push. 6 days into the war, the Suwalki Gap and the scorched fields of eastern Poland, the smoke from 1,000 burning tanks had finally begun to settle into a thick, low-hanging smog that tasted of sulfur and oxidized steel. No one had officially called for a ceasefire, yet the guns on both sides had simply gone quiet as the machines ran out of fuel and the men ran out of reasons to die. The Baltic air was cold and heavy with the scent of wet ash, a gray and indifferent shroud covering the wreckage of two empires that had spent their entire modern history preparing for a collision that had finally broken them both. The Great Blindness, that initial surge, of electronic warfare that had erased the digital world in a single hour had finally begun to dissipate as the batteries of the Russian jamming pods failed, and the Allied satellite arrays were slowly brought back online. But as the screens flickered back to life in the command bunkers of Washington and Moscow, the high-fidelity maps they revealed were not a source of triumph, but of a deep and hollow horror. They saw a Europe that had been physically rearranged by the violence, with 2 million soldiers and tens of thousands of armored vehicles locked in a static, bleeding embrace that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains. The clean, electronic war of the future had been a lie. The reality was a return to the mud, the trench, and the mass grave. A regression that had cost both sides the very technological superiority they had sought to defend. The 1st Guards Tank, Army, and the 1st Cavalry Division stood frozen in a landscape of craters and twisted titanium, their engines silent for the first time in 144 hours. There was no grand ceremony to mark the end of the movement. Only the slow, rhythmic sound of cooling metal, and the occasional, distant pop of a secondary explosion from a long-dead hull. The soldiers on both sides emerged from their fighting positions like sleepwalkers, their eyes hollow, and their skin stained gray by the dust of a dozen different battlefields, looking at each other across the narrow strips of no man's land with a shared, wordless understanding of the futility of the struggle. They had fought for the Suwalki Gap, for the ports of Germany, and for the soul of the continent. Yet all they had truly achieved was the transformation of a prosperous landscape into a museum of industrial ruin. The geopolitical resolution was not a treaty signed in a gilded hall, but a desperate, unspoken agreement to stop before the nuclear threshold was finally crossed, and the history of the human race was ended in a single afternoon. The Russian Federation had secured a buffer of scorched earth, but its economy was in a state of terminal collapse, and its military prestige was buried in the mud of Poland. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization had held the line, but its unity was fractured by the shared trauma of the Blitz, and its belief in the invulnerability of the digital shield was gone forever. This was the peace of the exhausted, a stalemate where both boxers had collapsed in the center of the ring, unable to lift a hand even to claim a victory that no longer existed. The philosophical weight of the conflict settled over the world like a cold winter fog. A realization that the age of the machine had not saved humanity from its oldest and most violent impulses. The high-tech dream of the 21st century had been stripped away by the silent thunder of the electronic strike, leaving the world to face the same dark questions of power and survival that had plagued it since the first stone was thrown in anger. The ash and the iron was all that remained the physical residue of a conflict that had proven that the more advanced we become, the more devastatingly primitive we remain when the lights finally go out. The silence between the reloads was not the sound of peace. It was the sound of a world that had seen its own end and was now trying to remember how to breathe in the smoke. As the first civilian, relief convoys began to move through the ruins of the Polish border. The sun finally broke through the heavy, soot-stained clouds, casting a long and pale light over the graveyard of the 20th century. The war had not changed the map in any way that mattered to the dead, and the survivors were left to rebuild a world that felt fundamentally smaller and more fragile than it had been a week prior. The Great Blindness was over, but the clarity it brought was a terrifying one. The knowledge that the distance between civilization and the abyss is only as thick as a single inverse wire, and that once that wire is cut, there is only the ash, the iron, and the long, cold wait for the next storm.